Most fights start with a simple misread. You see a driver swerve or get a one-word text, and a tiny spark turns into a loud reaction because your mind fills in the rest. It never feels like that should be the whole story. The reason it becomes one is that your first 5 seconds are automatic. You tell yourself a narrative, you react, and then everyone treats that reaction as the truth. There is a mental discipline that breaks that loop. It's not about bottling emotions. It's about noticing the first impulse, labeling it, and taking one measured follow-up. So a curt email stays an email and a snide comment stays information, instead of detonating a fight. Think about the last time you regretted blowing up. Learning this small habit means you won't stop feeling, but you'll stop being driven by other people's moods, keep relationships from derailing, and make clearer choices in the moment. The first habit: noticing tiny triggers before they snowball. Small things set the whole show in motion. A clipped sentence, a phone buzz during a meeting, a colleague who doesn't make eye contact. They trigger a chain reaction in the body first. The jaw tightens, breath gets shallow, attention narrows, and then the mind starts spinning explanations that feel urgent and true. That immediate biology pushes thought into story mode, and stories grow fast. So what starts as a tiny irritation can cascade into a full argument, a sleepless night, or a rash email. There's a consistent gap between the sensation and the interpretation. The throat tightens before the accusation forms. The stomach knots before the "they don't respect me" narrative appears. Noticing the bodily cue breaks the automatic timeline. In one office example, a manager's brief noted on a draft used to lead to hours of worry. Recognizing the first heat in the chest turned the reaction from rumination into a short check-in instead, and the issue stayed small. Subtle behaviors are the common sparks: a sigh that lands like a verdict, a short laugh that feels like mockery, a raised eyebrow that reads as contempt. Those microcues are interpreted through personal filters: past hurts, current stress, hunger, and the interpretation determines whether the moment balloons or fades. When the sigh is seen as merely tiredness rather than an attack, the exchange stays elastic. When it's seen as dismissal, the next reply is defensive and the scene escalates. Over time, the habit of scanning for tiny triggers changes the default trajectory of interactions. Pauses get longer, choices get clearer, and fewer small incidents turn catastrophic. People report fewer late-night replays of conversations and shorter, calmer exchanges at work and home. The mechanism is straightforward. Early detection interrupts the escalation chain, reduces the fuel for negative stories, and lets responses be chosen instead of reflexive. Naming and analyzing the feeling like a curious friend. Emotions register first as bodily sensations: a tight throat, a pounding chest, a hollow in the stomach. That physical signal often arrives before any coherent thought does, and it creates a pressure to act, snap back in a message, freeze in a conversation, or withdraw. In one concrete instance, a person who gets a curt email feels their hands go cold and types a blunt reply in 3 minutes. The body pushed the decision before the mind had a chance to check the stakes. Giving that experience a simple label often breaks the automatic escalation and buys time. A curious inner voice treats the feeling like a piece of information rather than a verdict on character. Instead of judging, it asks gentle questions. What exactly is this sensation? What triggered it just now? Is there something underneath it? Fear, hunger, fatigue? After a fight, someone might notice a flush and think, "This is humiliation," then remember a critical comment from childhood that echoed. That connection explains why the reaction was disproportionate and, because the source becomes visible, the impulse to retaliate softens. Researchers who study affect labeling describe measurable changes in the brain when people put feelings into words. The limbic response tends to calm and the thinking parts engage more. Therapists mirror this in practice by reflecting a client's emotion back as a hypothesis rather than a diagnosis. It sounds like you're feeling overwhelmed, and people often relax enough to explain specifics. In a team meeting, when a person names frustration and then traces it to unclear deadlines, the group stops guessing motives and starts fixing process, and the mood shifts from blame to problem solving. Over time, treating inner experience like a curious friend builds a habit of inquiry that changes outcomes. An athlete who notices nervous and explores whether it's excitement or fear can choose a breathing routine rather than choke. A parent who recognizes a surge of panic at a late text and identifies it as anxiety about letting someone down might call to check calmly instead of escalating. The point isn't to suppress the feeling, but to translate it into usable data. Once a feeling is understood, it loses the mysterious power to hijack behavior. A simple mental protocol: pause, probe, choose. Most people react before they think when provoked, and that split second often turns a tiny irritation into a full-blown fight. Acting on autopilot is driven by habit, so a quick interruption changes what happens next. The mental protocol that follows is simple in structure: pause, probe, choose. A short sequence that breaks the reflex and creates space for a considered response. In practice, it turns knee-jerk escalation into deliberate action, and that difference shows up in concrete ways. Fewer burned bridges at work, calmer family conversations, less adrenaline after a commute. The pause is the interruption everyone underestimates. A brief pause stops the cascade of justifications and counterattacks, because the first words you give off are usually defensive. Picture being cut off in traffic. The usual arc is immediate anger, a gesture, then a longer story in your head about how the other driver is a jerk. A pause breaks that arc, so the person who cut you off remains an event rather than a definition of your day. That short gap doesn't solve the problem, but it prevents escalation, and it gives your thinking brain a chance to get involved. Once the reflex eases, probing uncovers what's actually happening inside and around you. People who probe ask soft questions to themselves, not to lecture but to clarify, like what I'm first feeling, and what I'm first assuming. For example, when a colleague fires off a curt email, the first read can feel like a personal attack. Probing often shows the email was rushed, or the sender was under pressure from a client, or the tone was simply poor formatting. That single insight changes the likely response from a defensive retort into a response that addresses the real issue, because probing separates facts from stories. Choosing is where the benefit becomes visible over time. Once you've paused and probed, you aren't stuck with the automatic pile of words that would have left regret. Choices are guided by desired outcomes rather than raw emotion. Consider a parent dealing with a toddler's meltdown at the grocery. One option is to mirror frustration and create a spectacle. Another is to name the feeling, set a boundary, or step outside briefly. Outcomes differ wildly. People who practice this sequence report fewer damaged relationships and better decision quality, because choice links the short interruption to long-term goals. Small practices help it stick: noticing the first breath, mentally asking one clarifying question, and picturing the consequence of two possible replies make the protocol usable in real moments without turning conversations into scripts. Training your reactions with small, repeatable experiments. Most emotional responses are automatic. The body often acts before the mind finishes the sentence, so a sharp comment from a colleague can make your chest tighten and your mouth go defensive. That tension is useful as information, but it also hijacks choice. Because the brain defaults to the fastest path, small experiments are the deliberate way of creating alternate, quieter paths. Micro-experiments break a reaction into tiny, repeatable steps so you can see what each change produces. One person first talked with started by treating every mildly annoying email as a lab trial. She waited 10 seconds, typed a neutral phrase, and then closed the draft without sending for 5 minutes, and logged whether her tone softened when she came back. The effect was simple and observable. Less exclamation marks, fewer sharp clauses, because the brief delay interrupted the automatic defensive loop and let cooler language edge into the message. The point people often miss is that the experiments are about testing one variable, not proving a personality flaw. A friend practiced saying a low-stakes phrase out loud before meetings. First, I'll note that, and watched whether the room stayed calmer. Another practiced breathing for 3 breaths before answering her partner during small disagreements. These rehearsals don't erase feeling. They show cause and effect, change the pre-response action, and the outcome in tone and escalation changes too. Small, measurable changes stack into larger shifts when repeated. Repetition builds familiarity in the nervous system, so the next time a trigger appears, the new response is more likely to arrive first. People who keep a one-line log after each experiment, trigger, action taken, outcome, tend to notice patterns faster, like which phrases diffuse tension and which moves escalate it, and that awareness feeds more precise experiments. Holding warmth and boundary, empathy without being pulled in. Emotional contagion is a well-documented phenomenon. People pick up one another's moods without meaning to. You know the sensation. After an hour with a friend who's frantic, you feel jittery too, even though your day had been fine. In a meeting, it plays out the same way. One colleague's panic pulls the whole room into rushed decisions and worse outcomes, because anxiety narrows everyone's focus. The cause is simple. Mirror neurons and shared cues make emotions contagious, and when you don't notice that process, you end up carrying feelings that aren't yours. There's a real difference between feeling for someone and being taken over by them. A therapist sitting with a grieving client can hold deep warmth while remaining lucid about what's happening, and that clarity actually helps the client calm down. Labeling works here. When the listener names the emotion, that sounds really heavy, the other person often becomes less flooded, because putting feelings into words helps reduce limbic arousal. So feeling warmth towards someone can coexist with a mental limit that prevents the listener's nervous system from being swept up. Physical and conversational cues matter a lot in holding both kindness and boundary. Picture a parent comforting a child who scraped a knee. The parent's tone is soft and their hand steady, and the child feels held without the parent turning teary themselves. In offices, it's similar. A manager who keeps a composed posture and steady voice when an employee vents creates containment, which lowers escalation and yields clearer problem solving. When the listener's body and language signal calm, the other person's system finds it easier to down-regulate, and that reduces the likelihood of emotional spillover. People use concrete mental habits to keep warmth from becoming entanglement. Some clinicians speak of mental holding, an image where a listener imagines placing the person's distress in a clear container nearby so it's acknowledged but not absorbed. Others notice early physical signs, shallow breathing, a tight throat, that mean they're beginning to internalize someone else's stress, and they pause to breathe and recenter. The effect is practical. Maintaining that subtle barrier preserves empathy and energy, which makes sustained support more effective and lowers the risk of burnout. Ever leave a conversation feeling raw? We went through the discipline that changes that, noticing the exact moment your chest tightens, pausing long enough to take a 3-second breath, naming the feeling out loud or in your head, and choosing one small, deliberate response instead of letting an old reflex blow the moment up. Maybe you snapped at someone and felt guilty afterward. That reflex comes from automatic wiring, and when you practice tiny anchors, a breath, the words first and tense, a simple boundary like leaving the room, the exchange usually cools instead of combusting, which keeps relationships intact and your own head clearer. It won't happen overnight. Real change comes from repeating small choices in low-stress moments, like slowing down before you answer a snarky text or saying the feelings name in the shower, and those repetitions add up so that when pressure comes, you don't get swept away. If that landed with you, you might want to stick around. First planning a short series of practical drills, a 1-minute breath anchor, a quick reframe for insults, and a 7-day micro-practice you can do in 2 minutes a day. So subscribing or following makes it easy to catch the next tool and see how each one chips away at reactivity. You don't have to be unshakable to be emotionally untouchable. One small pause, one honest label, one tiny boundary. Over weeks you'll notice less reactivity, clearer choices, and a steadiness that feels like standing in the rain without getting soaked. First, I'll see you in the next video where we try the first drill together.